In the black hours after midnight, the tanker slid past the blinking lights of Valdez Narrows and into Prince William Sound. Snow flurries ticked against steel. Ice had drifted south from Columbia Glacier all evening, pushing traffic out of the westbound lane. At 12:04 a.m. on March 24, 1989, the harbor pilot stepped off and the Exxon Valdez kept on, 3 football fields long and 9 stories tall, thick with North Slope crude. On the bridge, the captain left the conning to his third mate, while the helmsman watched the compass steady at 200 degrees. The big ship was outside the marked traffic lane to skirt the Bergy Bitts, running toward a waypoint that would swing her back clear of Bligh Reef. The radar that could have painted the reef's day mark in the dark had been down for months. The third mate called for a turn. At 12:04, he ordered 10 degrees left. The bull answered slow. At 12:05, he asked for 20. The helmsman repeated, the rudder moaned, and the ship kept carrying forward on mass and momentum. Seconds stretched. The shoreline loomed darker than the sky. At 12:07, the hull found rock. The first strike lifted men where they stood. Steel rang like a dropped I-beam, and the Exxon Valdez opened along 8 cargo tanks. Crude under 1,200 pounds of pressure surged into seawater cold enough to paralyze a hand. The ship stopped hard, pinned on Bligh Reef, 5 miles outside the lane she was supposed to be in. Below decks, tankermen opened valves by feel and found nothing they did mattered. Sounding tapes came up black. The chief mate logged the first estimates and underlined the time. On VHF, the Coast Guard watch asked for position, damage, persons injured, and whether the ship could make way. The answer circled back to the same word, grounded. A flight from Kodiak launched toward the glow of deck lights and a lengthening stain that ran off into the dark. The first call to the Coast Guard described a grounding and some oil. That changed by the minute. Black slicks spread on the flood like a bruise, then fanned wider as the tide turned. By dawn, the smell reached fishing cabins on Bligh Island, sweet, heavy, chemical, and the sea around the tanker looked like coffee with no end. Alyeska's emergency tug was hours away. Skimmers and boom from the industry stockpile were short, scattered, or frozen into service yards behind locked gates. The weather, calm at first, shifted by afternoon. Wind lifted a chop that broke booms and drove oil into inlets nobody had on a checklist. The numbers turned into a kind of map. Roughly 10.8 to 11 million gallons left the ship, more than any spill in U.S. waters to that day. Oil rode tides and storm fetch over 1,300 miles of shoreline. Murray colonies went silent. Sea otters, fur so dense they should never feel cold, washed ashore slicked and shivering until they stopped moving. Harbor seals hauled out on blackened rocks and leaked rainbow from their flanks. An eagle tried to lift from a stump and dropped when its wings glued together. A local orcapod lost calves and then adults. Decades later, its numbers never recovered. The response mixed bravery and confusion. Fishermen bolted plywood into makeshift skimmers, then towed them behind signers until the lines snapped. Volunteers in white suits crouched on stones with towels and Dawn soap, rinsing birds under hoses while the snow fell on their backs. Helicopters moved crews from bay to bay. Someone always pointed at a map and said the oil would be there next. Dispersant, Corexit 9527, was sprayed from planes when weather allowed. Crews blasted beaches with hot water to lift tar mats, not always knowing they were also blasting out the life that holds a beach together. In the slick itself, a skimmer clogged. Another arrived with the wrong fittings. A barge full of boom showed up with no anchors to hold it. On the radio, fishermen argued with contractors about which cove mattered more. The oil kept finding the next cove anyway. In the months after, numbers were the only honest language left. 250,000 seabirds, give or take. Some counts ran higher. more than 2,800 sea otters, 300 harbor seals, a few dozen eagles. Herring, which had been money in the bank for local boats, collapsed in the early 1990s and never returned to form. Pink salmon came back faster in places and then failed in others. Tourist towns emptied. Families who had always worked the spring opener watched their nets hang dry and wondered how to pay for fuel they couldn't use. The courts filled the time the tide could not. Exxon pled guilty to criminal violations and paid fines and restitution. A civil consent decree set out almost $900 million for restoration over a decade. A jury later set punitive damages at $5 billion. Appeals cut that to $507.5 million in 2008. The numbers didn't stitch the coastline back together. In cordoned coves, crews buried test pits and found oil years later, still peanut butter thick under a crust of clean stones. It smelled the same the day they dug it up as the day it left a ruptured tank. Some changes stuck. Congress passed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which required double-hulled tankers in U.S. waters and a real plan for worst-case spills, with equipment within hours, not days. Pilots rode deep-draft ships longer through the Sound. Tanker lanes were redrawn. Practice drills became less like parades and more like work. The state, the feds, the industry consortium, and fishermen's groups built a citizen oversight council on Prince William Sound to make sure the next promises had teeth. But the Sound keeps its own calendar. A winter storm 10 years later would rip open a cove and smear old oil through gravel like it was new. Clam beds in some places stayed empty long after the advertisements said the water was fine. Scientists ticked off lessons in papers and at kitchen tables that oil weathers but does not disappear, that the wrong cleanup can be its own damage, that small decisions made on a quiet night can right themselves across a century of shore. The men on the bridge that night lost more than licenses. Third mate Gregory Cousins carried the turn order in his head for the rest of his life. Captain Joseph Hazelwood became a shorthand on talk radio for negligence. The trial record was harder and stranger than the caricature, but the caricature is what survived. Every spring, fishermen who worked the response talk about the smell that never quite leaves a boat. They remember the way otters went still when you wrapped them in towels and the look in their eyes when they decided the hands were warm enough to trust. If you walk the headlands near Bly Reef on a calm day, the water looks clean again. Kelp lifts and settles. Sea lions bark. Then a boot heel turns a stone and a smell comes up you can name without thinking. Prince William Sound is beautiful and busy again. Tugs escort loaded tankers, cruise ships move like small towns, seiners chase salmon along the tide lines, but no one who was there pretends the slate is clean. The map of where the oil went still lives in people's heads. On March 24, 1989, one ship in the wrong place for a few minutes rowed itself across 1,000 miles of coast and decades of work. Regulations hardened, equipment improved, and the Sound got a citizen's voice it had never had. The damage lingered anyway, in beaches that bleed when you dig, in families that changed careers because the fish never came back, in the way a quiet night watch now carries the weight of a different kind of weather report, not just wind and tide, but consequence. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.